It was around 2 a.m., a summer night in Saigon. Mrs. Khan woke up abruptly, sitting up in shock, looking around the house. She cried out in her dream, desperately struggling for a few minutes before managing to open her eyes and wake up. She sat back against the wall, sweat dripping profusely from her face. She took a deep breath and regained her composure, recalling every detail of the nightmare that had just occurred. Beside her, within the white and opaque mosquito net, Mr. Khan was still sleeping peacefully. He lay on his back, his mouth slightly open, his hands resting on his chest as if a lifeless body had been laid in a coffin, waiting for burial. Mrs. Khan grabbed the paper fan at the head of the bed, fanned herself for a moment, then quickly folded it back and lightly tapped her husband's shoulder, calling out, "Wake up, dear. Wake up, I have something to tell you." Mr. Khan squinted his eyes, looking at his wife and then immediately closing them again, and asked groggily, "What time is it?" "It's still early. Why wake up so early?" Mrs. Khan threw the fan aside, leaned over, and grabbed her husband's arm, shaking it forcefully. She said, wake up quickly, I want to tell you this, it's really scary, dear." Mr. Khan turned his body sideways, frowned, and responded, "Well, go ahead and tell me, I'm listening." "Why didn't you wait until tomorrow morning to tell me? How can you wake someone up in the middle of the night like this?" Mrs. Khan lay down next to her husband, anxious, and said, "Darling, it's been a long time since our daughter, Trin, visited home, and there hasn't been any letters either. It's been a whole year already." Mr. Khan clicked his tongue and interrupted, "Well, she's married now, so it's only natural for her to be with her husband. She visits during the Lunar New Year, once a year, that's enough. As for letters, why would she write any if there's nothing important? Just go to sleep." Mrs. Khan, frustrated, spoke louder, "I can't sleep, I just had a dream that she was in trouble." Mr. Khan replied sharply, "If you're worried about her, then you dream about her. There's nothing strange about it. I also often dream about her, let alone you. Go to sleep, tomorrow morning I'll write a few words to her to put your mind at ease, now go to sleep." Mrs. Khan sat up again and patiently continued, "No, dear. It's not just an ordinary dream. If it was just a dream about her, why would I wake you up? I'm afraid something unfortunate has happened, dear." The last plea she made in a choked voice made Mr. Khan uneasy. He couldn't sleep anymore, took a deep breath, tiredly sat up, took the fan, and fanned his wife's sweat. He explained to reassure her, "It's because of the hot weather that you had that dream. I'm the same way. Whenever it's hot, I tend to have dreams or talk nonsense, as if there's something pressing on my chest." Mrs. Khan wiped her tears, cleared her throat, and calmly said, "Sir, it's quite strange. I clearly saw that my daughter Trin was standing outside the door, looking pale. She called out to me. It seemed to be getting dark, and I couldn't see her face clearly, so I asked, 'Who's there?' But she had a fearful expression and stood trembling at the door, as if afraid of something. As I looked closely, I realized it was her. I was overjoyed and said, 'When did you come back? Come inside with Mom. Did you come home?' I asked 2 or 3 times, but she didn't answer, just bowed her head and looked down at her feet. I was about to pull her inside when she slowly backed away, then turned and ran off. She was right in front of me, but I couldn't catch up no matter how much I chased after her. I shouted, "Where are you going? Why don't you come inside with Mom?" But she kept running away. When I almost caught up to her and tried to grab her by the sleeve, she suddenly turned around. Oh my goodness, her face was as pale as a ghost. That's when she told me, "Mom, I'm dead." I was terrified, and that's when I woke up. Madam Khan paused, burst into tears, and concluded, "I'm afraid something isn't right, sir. For the past few days, I've felt a burning sensation inside me, and my eyes have been twitching. And I don't know what's wrong with our daughter Trin." Mr. Khan clicked his tongue in response, saying, "I've already told you, dreams are just dreams. It's simply because you miss her that you're having these nightmares. If anything were wrong, her husband would have informed us." Madam Khan shook her head firmly and interjected, "No, sir. I've been alive for nearly 50 years, and I've never had such a horrifying dream. I'm just scared, that's all." Mr. Khan pulled back the curtain and slipped out to go downstairs, instructing his wife not to worry anymore. "Go back to bed and rest. Tomorrow morning, I'll go to the post office and send a telegram. The back and forth letters are nerve-wracking. I'll investigate, and as soon as it's light out, I'll leave." Madam Khan didn't say anything and waited for her husband to go to the back. She got out of bed, lit incense on the ancestral altar, and fervently prayed for their daughter's safety. After a while, Mr. Khan returned, and Madam Khan lay down beside him. She couldn't sleep anymore from that moment on. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the terrifying image of her daughter, with a painful gaze, looking at her as if pleading. Quietly, she pulled back the curtain, sneaked out, wandered around the house, and then stood in front of the altar, praying earnestly. Time passed slowly, and it wasn't until she heard the neighbor's rooster crowing for the third time that she hurriedly opened the door. The street was still empty, and there was no sound of delivery trucks selling breakfast. She worried for a moment and then woke her husband up. Mr. Khan was still half asleep but respected his wife's wishes, so he rubbed his eyes and sat up. As he stepped outside to wash his face, he said, "The post office opens at 8 o'clock. Even if I go early, I'll have to wait for it to open. Who would let me in at this hour?" Madam Khan followed behind her husband and said, "Well, you can wait at the post office for a while. Send a telegram right away for the sake of our daughter Trin. Just write, 'Mother is seriously ill. Come home immediately.'" Mr. Khan didn't say anything because his wife was giving him unnecessary instructions. Of course, he knew what to write in a telegram. He went to the tap in the backyard, sat down, and brushed his teeth. To calm her nerves, Madam Khan boiled water and made tea, bringing it to her husband. Mr. Khan spent some time in the backyard, then went inside to change his clothes. His eyes still stung from lack of sleep. But seeing his wife so anxious, he decided to leave early. He stopped by the dining table for a bowl of pho and went to the post office. He didn't believe that dreams could be a sign of an impending event. Moreover, the road from Vung Tau to Saigon wasn't that far. If his son had something happen, his son's husband would have informed them. He picked up his teacup, took a big sip, and pushed the door open with his Honda. Sitting on the bike, starting the engine, he suddenly came up with something he thought was reasonable. He turned his head back and said to his wife, "Dear, I think we shouldn't send a telegram to our son saying, 'Mother is seriously ill, come back immediately.' Suddenly, we would make him worried, and he and his spouse would be anxious, wondering why we called him back. Should he quit his job and make the journey to Saigon? And how would you explain it when you meet him? Would you say it's because you dreamt of his death and had to call him back? No, dear, we shouldn't do that. I just need to send him a brief message saying, 'Trin, write a letter to your parents,' and that will be enough." Mrs. Kan agreed with her husband's reasoning but still impatiently said, "When will the letter arrive?" "But it's up to you. I'm very anxious." Mr. Kan changed his license plate, rushed onto the main road, and his wife's dream made him remember a foolish game from his youth when he and a few friends were still studying in the outskirts of Hanoi. In their early adulthood, they read Western books and told ghost stories to each other about mysterious castles with restless souls haunting them. Among the 4 boarding students, Kan was the youngest and smallest, but always stubbornly refused to believe in ghosts or, if they did exist, that they were anything to be afraid of. One day, 3 neighbors died of tuberculosis and they were buried in a nearby cemetery. The other 3 challenged Kan, if he dared to go alone at midnight and stab a newly built grave with a knife, they would all be convinced. Deep down, Kan was also very worried, but he tried to appear calm and composed on the surface, accepting the challenge. That night, it drizzled, not heavy rain, but thunder and lightning flashed continuously. The outskirts of Hanoi at that time were dark, unlike later on. That night, they gathered to play cards to kill time, waiting until exactly 11 o'clock when Kan would venture out with a knife. Sometimes Kan felt weak and wanted to give up, but his pride prevented him from backing down because he had already boasted. When Kan left, the 3 friends quickly put on their coats, donned caps, and followed him to the cemetery. Of course, they made sure Kan couldn't see them. They hid behind the trees, behind the tombstones, observing Kan. They were very nervous and looked at each other, silently expressing their admiration for Kan's boundless courage. When they returned, they would treat Kan to a big celebration. As for Kan, stepping into the desolate cemetery on a rainy and windy night, wearing a cloth cap, an old raincoat, and holding a knife, he could feel his hand trembling, even though his mind kept reassuring him, "There are no ghosts." If only Kan knew his 3 friends were hiding behind the trees, watching him, he would have been less scared, because at least he would have had someone by his side. But Kan thought he was alone in this dark and mysterious sacred land, with thousands of tombstones around him, making him increasingly terrified. Approaching the new grave, Kan opened his eyes wide and stared intently. The image of the deceased neighbor passing by his house and now lying under the grave since yesterday morning sent shivers down Kan's spine, causing him to stumble and fall. After hesitating for a while, Ken gathered his courage and rushed forward, raising the knife and thrusting it strongly into the grave. After stabbing the knife, Ken turned around and ran away, but from under the grave, a hand reached out and firmly grabbed Ken's raincoat. Ken was horrified, struggling, slipping on the muddy ground, falling backward, and fainting. When Ken regained consciousness, supported by his 3 friends, his face was still pale, and he firmly believed that the return of the dead was real. The 3 friends just looked at each other without saying a word. The next day, CN waited calmly until they finally told him that there was no such thing as ghosts or demons. It turned out that when he stabbed the knife into the grave, he had actually stabbed his own raincoat. When he tried to run away, the coat got stuck on the tomb, making it impossible for CN to escape. He was so scared that he fainted right there. From that day until now, the young boy had grown into Mr. CN, over 50 years old. He was not reckless anymore, but he had never encountered any ghosts. Today, when he heard his wife's story, he naturally didn't believe that their daughter had died and returned. However, to avoid his wife's nagging, which he knew would last the whole day, he agreed to her request. Once Mr. CN left, Mrs. CN hurriedly took a pedicab to Penang to inform Tam, their eldest daughter who had married a welder there, about her vague news. They had only 2 daughters. Tam had given them 2 grandchildren, while Trin, who had been married for 3 years, had not yet had her first child. Trin's husband, Mr. H.C., had an old brick house that was left to him by his parents in the town of VNG Tau. Mrs. CN arrived at Tam's house while the iron gate was still closed. The small street began to wake up. But Mr. Nip's welding shop, Tam's husband, didn't open early. Mrs. CN knocked on the door for a while, and Nip stuck his head out, wearing only shorts. He looked surprised at his pale-faced mother-in-law and immediately guessed that his in-laws had just had a fight, and Mrs. CN had to run to seek refuge at their house. Nip pushed open the door wider and said, "Mother came early. Please come in, our house hasn't woken up yet." Mrs. CN squeezed in and replied, "I came early because I needed to see Tam about something." Nip turned and shouted, "Tam, Mom came looking for you, wake up." Mrs. CN anxiously went straight into the bedroom and approached her daughter's bed, pulling back the curtain. The 2 children in the adjacent bed also sat up, looking at their grandmother in confusion, and then got out of bed and ran over. Tam sat up, startled, and asked, "What's the matter that Mom came so early?" Mrs. CN teared up as she recounted every detail of the dream from last night. Tam didn't want her 2 children to hear the horrifying story, so she shooed them to the kitchen to wash their faces and get ready for school. Then she shook her head and said, just like her father, "How can you believe in dreams? You dream about it because you remember it, not because it has any meaning." Mrs. CN shook her head and said, "No, my dear, I'm very worried. There must be something very scary happening. I clearly heard it say, 'You're dead,' and its voice was so strange, I can't forget it." Tam pondered for a moment and suggested, "Or, let your husband and son-in-law take you to the VNG Tau bus station. It would be more convenient for you to meet Trin there, right? Sitting at home worrying would be enough to drive you crazy. Then, Tam went downstairs to the house and called out loudly, "Hey, dear, take Mom to the bus station and buy her a ticket for the earliest trip to VNG Tower. She needs to meet Trin." Mrs. CN hesitated, intending to go, but then changed her mind and told Tam, "Forget it, my child, maybe tomorrow. Your father and brother are going to check the telegraph first. If they receive any news, they'll let me know." Tam was satisfied and said, "Okay, that works too. Stay here with us today, and later I'll go to the market to buy some chicken to make a few dishes." Mrs. CN sighed, "I don't feel like eating." Tam stood up, pulled back the curtain, and thought for a moment before pitifully saying to her mother, "How about this? Let me take the Honda and drive you straight to Vung Tau. You're anxious waiting for news from Trin, and you can't do anything. Let me take you, okay?" Mrs. Kan didn't say anything, but Tam understood that her mother agreed to the proposal. She went down to the kitchen to consult her husband and prepared her clothes for the trip. From Saigon to Vung Tau, it was only 100 kilometers, but it was difficult to travel in those days. Mrs. Kan pondered for a while and suddenly changed her mind, telling her daughter, "Never mind, it's better for me to go back. Otherwise, your father will scold you. If I have to go, I need to talk to your father first. I'm anxious, but if I've already sent a telegram, then we have to wait until tomorrow to see what happens before we go." Tam nodded, "Yes, Mother, you're right. If there's no news in 3 days, let me know, and we'll go together." Mrs. Kan sadly walked out to welcome the cyclone. Tam turned and called out loudly, "Hey, Dad, Mom's coming back." Mr. Nip, who was brewing coffee, hurriedly ran up to see her off and said, "Let us know if there's any news, Mom." Mrs. Kan nodded slightly, silently walked out onto the street. Sitting on the cyclo, she turned back and told the driver to take her straight to Zaloi Pagoda. Mrs. Kan recited Buddhist scriptures to pray for peace for her daughter, whose image from last night haunted her intensely. It was past noon when she finally returned home. For the remaining time, she wandered in and out, not saying anything to her husband, causing Mr. Kan to feel both pity and annoyance. In the evening, she stayed up very late. In the middle of the night, Mr. Kan had slept for quite a long time, but Mrs. Kan was still burning incense on the altar. She stood praying for a long time before finally climbing into bed next to her husband. Just as she was about to fall asleep, she saw Trin, her youngest daughter, standing outside the door. The same clothes, the same hair, and the faint worried expression in her eyes, just like last night, stirred Mrs. Kan's emotions. Startled, she asked, "When did you come back? The door is still open, why didn't you come in?" Miss Trin stood still, looking at her mother without responding. Mr. Kan hurriedly stepped out to the yard and said, "Come in with Mom. Did you come back alone, or do you have a husband with you?" Before Mrs. Kan could finish her sentence, she saw Trin quickly turn around and leave. She ran after her, but there seemed to be some force pulling her back, and she tightly held onto her leg. Her daughter's figure grew farther and farther away, until she finally disappeared behind a large tree by the side of the road. Mrs. Kan stood still, tears streaming down her face as she watched, and then suddenly Trin turned back and swiftly returned, standing right beside her and saying, Mom, I'm dead. Mrs. Khan screamed in horror and woke up. Mr. Khan was holding her arm, shaking it vigorously and asking, "Why are you yelling so loudly, waking up the whole house? What did you dream about?" Mrs. Khan took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and suddenly realized that she had just been dreaming and it wasn't real. She burst into tears and told Mr. Khan, "Oh, you know, our Trin is definitely in trouble. I just dreamed of her exactly like last night. Every time, she tells me that she's dead." As soon as she finished speaking, she burst into loud sobs and lay down on the bed. Mr. Khan began to worry. Last night, when he heard his wife's story for the first time, he didn't pay much attention, thinking that she was just having a vivid dream because she missed their daughter. But tonight, if that horrifying dream repeated, then either their daughter had crossed over to the other world or at least his wife had a nervous breakdown and needed to see a doctor for treatment. He asked his wife again, "What did you just say?" "She said she's dead?" Mrs. Khan choked back tears and replied, "I remember it clearly, I can't be mistaken. Just like yesterday, she told me that she's dead." Mr. Khan lay still, his eyes staring at the ceiling. Mrs. Khan continued, "Both times she appeared, she was wearing the outfit I personally made for her before she got married." Mr. Khan hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm not exactly sure. But to ease my anxiety, tomorrow morning I'll go to the bus station and catch the earliest bus straight to her house to see if anything's wrong." Mrs. Khan sat up and said, "Let me go instead. Tam and I can take our car, it'll be faster. The buses are usually slow because they pick up passengers along the way." Mr. Khan agreed immediately, saying, "That works too. You should get some sleep now. Wake up around 7 o'clock, and then we'll go."